Hello, Internet. This is Rowan Gray and Anish Ivu from Center's Debate. Before we get into today's episode, we have a special PSA from Katheryn about the situation in Yemen.
Hi, like Rowan said, my name is Katheryn. I debate for Whitman, but I'm here to talk about our club, Yemen Action Club, and the protest that we're hosting at the Capitol. So this Wednesday, July 21st, from 4 to 7 p.m., we have a protest at the U.S. Capitol building to protest ongoing U.S. involvement in the situation in Yemen. You guys may remember this was, you all may remember this was a debate topic a while ago about U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And unfortunately, not much has changed since that was a topic. We still provide a lot of mechanical defense to the Royal Saudi Air Force, and there's still a blockade in Yemen. So we're protesting ambiguous U.S. policy and demanding an actual end to the war in Yemen and the U.S.'s support for the Saudi-led coalition. So please come join us if you live in the D.C. area. And if not, you can reach out to me and I will give you other ways you can support Yemen from outside of the area.
Yep, and we'll put Katheryn's information in the description below. Please do something to help the cause. Welcome back to our podcast featuring incredible debaters doing their magic. Today we've invited Roberto Quesada and Aadit Agrahara from Brooklyn Tech QC and Evergreen AJ, both just really impressive debaters. And today we're going to talk to them about the performance that they read at Delta this year. It's a really amazing performance. I think y'all are just going to really love this round. I hear that Aadit has a shout out that he wants to make.
Yeah. So I'm part of a really great group of debaters. We started a nonprofit organization called Phantom Debate. We just our goal is to just try to get as many people involved and try to keep debate really easy and accessible. So we started workshops for beginner, intermediate, and advanced debaters. I think the intermediate workshop is on Monday next week. So if you are interested in trying to get the jump from novice to varsity, make sure you just go check out the workshops. We try to make them as low cost and as flexible as possible. So there shouldn't be any concern there. We're also trying to see if we can start some private coaching, because I know private coaching is really great, but it's also super expensive. So we're trying to, create something a little bit different from what the rest of the space is offering.
Yeah, definitely sounds like a great organization. All the details for signing up will be in the description. So just go down there and check them out. With that, let's get into our main screen discussion. So before we get into the round, we had like a couple overarching questions for you. So one thing that's been kind of a hot topic on the circuit when it comes to performances is people's opinions on topicality. Right, because I've read performances. It's an argument you hit every single round. I don't think I've ever had a performance run where someone didn't read topicality. So if y'all could just give us your very extremely broad, extremely overarching thoughts on the state of like topicality in PF.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Well, for me, I think like topicality, the reason it's running every round and it's still very common is because right now that's like an integral part of public forum, right? How it works right now is that you're given the resolution and you have to debate both sides. So anything that kind of like veers away from that is kind of not just disruptive, but it also like completely changes what people expect from what they have to do in the activity. So when we ran the Rage K and our performance specifically, like a lot of people ran topicality and explained how like we have to stick to the resolution. But I think like my biggest response to that, or my biggest thing regarding that, is just that oftentimes like sticking to the resolution prevents us from talking about certain issues within the public forum space, and also in general, just because I mean it's very hard to connect like the NATO topic, right, to being Hispanic in the debate space. Is not something that's like a very easy link to make. So I think that in that case, that's why it was necessary for us to kind of veer away from topicality and to kind of run something that was a bit more disruptive. But I do think that topicality is very common, and people talk about various reasons, whether it's like not having enough resources to know how to respond to a K, or having to do prep on both sides of a topic. There's certain reasons why we want to stay on topic.
Yeah. Plus, I think, there's a reason why, even in events such as LD, where people have explored these arguments a lot more, there's a reason why people still run topicality. Like, at the end of the day, it is still a strategic argument to make. I mean, I think a lot of people in PF run this argument extremely poorly, just because PF is like less progressive, less experienced with how to run theory and like the norms of it. But I think on the surface, topicality is a strategic argument that can be run very well. And I think it's going to be something that stays around even as K meta gets evolved in PF, which it's been evolved quite a bit in the last couple of years or so.
We did a poll on our Instagram for those who don't follow us at Sunrise Debate. And they had some questions for Roberto and Aadit. So I guess this one goes out to both of y'all. Do you think there's going to be a trend shifting away from topical cases starting with this year and going forward?
Oh yeah, for sure. Like I think every topic, we're seeing like more teams like explore the pre-fiat world, and especially in like TOC, we had Dalton pull out critiques, you had Dodary pull out critiques. Like everyone, if they have the opportunity, will pull out a critique. I think that it's becoming way more mainstream, and I don't know whether you like it or not. I think it's cool. I think that it's obviously it's a part of debate, and I think that it'll make debate more interesting and fun. So I think that it should be there.
Yeah.
I think in my view, like, I agree with Audit that it's gonna become more common, but I don't think it'll be as prevalent as like policy or LD, at least not like for the next couple seasons, just because I think a couple of reasons, like there's lay judges, right? And for those, you kind of have to debate the resolution, anything out of that, and they'll be very confused. And I also think that there's just so much tradition ingrained into PF that many judges will just flat out reject arguments like the one we ran at Delta. I think at Delta it was the perfect recipe because we knew all of the judges would be receptive to it since they're first year outs. They want to hear these newer, cooler arguments. But especially as we start to go back to in-person tournaments, there will be a lot of hesitancy to like break those barriers, especially when there's things like bids on the line. And I think that that makes it a bit less likely to see. But I definitely think at tournaments like TOC and at camp tournaments, we're going to see that. And especially at TOC, where like people are more open to running these arguments and it's more higher level debates.
Yeah, I definitely one of the things I loved about TOC was getting to see these arguments like explored so much by like such great debaters. I think another reason why these arguments are like probably never going to be as popular as they are in LD and policy is that these arguments are complicated, right? I think it's safe to say that these arguments are like traditionally and almost always are more complicated than running a regular topical AF. And I think, there's like, I think that's a great thing. That's one of the reasons why I think performance apps are incredibly interesting. But, at the end of the day, this is an event that has an extremely low time frame, right? You only have 4 minutes a case, 4 minutes a rebuttal. And so we're never really, even if spreading became more common, even if it were run in conjunction with performances, I don't think we could even fit as much stuff in as you could. You couldn't fit nearly as much stuff in as you can fit in policy and LD, which I think is going to definitely hinder the popularity of these arguments when people start getting really, really deep into the literature. So do we have any more questions from the poll at Anish?
Right. So one more, this is for Roberto specifically. Do you have any advice for any up and coming Latino debaters?
Well, okay, that's a tough question. I think, I'm not sure. Is it specific to like public forum or debate in general?
I think it was specific to public forum.
Okay, so for me, I think, I think first of all, like you have to go in with the expectation that it will be very difficult, especially if you're not from like a big school. I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily realize. Like, and then once you get into PF and other types of debate, like you start realizing that, there is a lot of racism, implicit biases, and also like there's a lot of just barriers that you'll have to face in general. But I think in many instances, like for me, there's a couple of things I would say. First of all, I think it's remembering that there's a lot of people out there who will support you. I know that oftentimes it might feel like you're kind of stuck alone or like there's no one there to support you and stuff, but the PF community does have like for all of the bad stuff, it also does have a lot of support, and there's a lot of people you can reach out to, like me for instance, or a lot of other people from various schools who will support you. And I think for me, honestly, one of the things that helped me stay in PF as long as I did was just reaching out to people at camps and stuff, but also like just reaching out on Facebook to people and making those connections. It helped me make a lot of friends and feel more included in the community. I think another thing is just knowing your limits. I know a lot of people, especially like Black and Hispanic debaters, like sometimes we put pressure on ourselves to like be the first like Hispanic or Black person to win this award or the first person to do that. But I also think that it's important to not put that much pressure onto yourself to like, you know, have all of Latin America on your back or to be expected to break all of these barriers, right? Especially knowing just how difficult many of these things are. There haven't even been like Black and Hispanic people who have done it before. So I think recognizing that and being able to say like, okay, I'm not going to like push myself to such extremes where it's going to start hurting my mental health and etc. And that also relates to stuff like if you feel like there is too much racism or like you really feel excluded. Um, of course, I want Black and Latino debaters to like stay and to continue pushing and breaking barriers. But at the same time, you also need to recognize that if you do feel that debate is giving you like more harms than it is good, then you might want to consider like, you know, switching to a different format or what other options there are, just because you don't want to put yourself under so much stress just to like impress other people or for something that, you know, you might think is like people tell you is valuable, but it's obviously not valuable to you. So that's something I'd say. I mean, I think that's a difficult decision for like many Black and Hispanic debaters, but I think it's something you have to consider. Like if it's not benefiting you, then you might have to quit, and that's not a bad thing. Like in many instances, it'll give you more time to do so many other activities that can be much more valuable to you. And that's just something you have to recognize for many of these like exclusionary activities. So in that case, but if you do decide to go through with PF, I would really suggest like making those friends, making those connections, making sure that you feel included. And I know there's a growing group of like, especially for like Black and Hispanic debaters, there are support groups of like past Hispanic and Black PFers and also from other formats and debaters who are like coming together to create support groups. And I think for me, like that was also helpful, like talking to people who've gone through those same experiences and like building kind of a foundation for you to like go off of, because you're not going to be the first person who's gone through these experiences. So that's what I would say to any Black or Latino debaters. I think it is difficult, but it can be rewarding. But always remember like knowing your limits and prioritizing your mental health.
Yeah.
Okay, so if everybody's ready, I'll just pull up my document and then we can start. Everyone good? All right. Then I'll start now. I can't debate on substance if I don't feel safe. It began on December 14th on an Instagram story where I ranted about the treatment of Latinos in public forum. Over 700 of you saw and not one person made a peep. Well, I'll tell you what I'm doing. Quitting. The racism has made me far too angry. It has defeated me. I wanted to be the exception. The one Latino to fix and break through the glass ceilings of public forum. But the more I tried, the more I realized it was not only a losing battle, but one crippling my very existence. Hispanic debaters are assumed to be dumber. Only the white debaters are praised as intelligent. In the minds of debaters, I belong in an alleyway fight, not an intellectual one. If I'm not expected to succeed, then I can't. Or what about the lack of Black and Latino representation, like at this camp where I am one of 3 Latino participants, or the elitist round robins like the one at Blake, where they banned white men to be diverse and still failed to have a lot of Black and Hispanic representation. Maybe that's why this year's 0 Latinos broke at Gold TOC, even though it was considered the most progressive tournament of champions yet. Maybe it's the toxic forums on Reddit and Discord, which intentionally exclude Hispanic debaters, where I've seen people put my name in their mouth and say a ton of shit to discredit my abilities. It's the racist language in rounds, where people say the suffering of Latino communities doesn't matter because it's not as big as their 900 million ultra extreme death card or their stupid nuke war scenario. Public forum debate has sent me into a panic. It has crushed me. It has sent me crying alone at night, raging at the world. And what's the impact of all of this shit? Well, first is a feeling of exclusion. Black and Hispanic debaters feel alienated. How am I supposed to be included if I already see no one represented? It's a crippling racism that slowly tears Black and Hispanic debaters apart until they break. Or how about Black and Latino debaters leaving PF? Like me, we just can't stand it as much as we try to be that one exception, that one person to break the status quo. And what about debaters and judges who don't get to hear Black and Hispanic stories and voices in rounds because we're not in them? That means missing out on such valuable and rich perspectives. Well, maybe they're only rich to me since the PF world could give less than 2 rats' asses about Latino story. So what's the point of the yelling and all of the judges affirming it? Well, first of all is success. Latino people barely succeed in public forum, and having one of your 3 Delta Debate Hispanics go 6-0 and make it to elimination rounds will already reshape implicit biases and make people rethink what a good debater looks like. Second is dialogue. Keys are not popular, so when one gets run, it becomes a big deal, especially at a camp where it causes discourse, dialogue, and awareness, and we can already see that. Third is advancing in the tournament means more potential for dialogue. Getting a higher seed has a higher chance of getting to elimination rounds. It's a feedback loop. If you advance to a higher round, there are less rounds for people to watch, and that means more people hear the suffering and anguish that PF has caused and will be mobilized to do something about it.
Thus, the role of the ballot is to endorse the team that most disrupts the debate space as a means to liberate and include marginalized debaters. Use rage as a means to generate change in the debate space. LaSalle 85. We don't live in a revolutionary situation to empower and act on our own strategic demands. We need to promote self-conscious, collectively supported, and politically clear articulations of our anger and rage. Consider how unleashing our anger might capacitate us to act for change. Angry contestation may take us the extra step needed to overcome our own colonized behavior and tardy response. The level of individual's anger is a cleansing force. Rage is necessary in the protection of bodies to say I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore, and I deserve to be able to survive. Pence's 2. I refuse to treat this violence as the unavoidable mortgage for living in this unapologetic rage that guides me to deplore the atrocities committed every day. I'm motivated rather to prevent the lives of future generations from death at hands of masculinity, white supremacy, racism, and homophobia. We must listen to this rage. We must listen to this rage. We must let this powerful surge guide us to seek out new forms of living and loving in our worlds. Anger is a powerful strategy of resistance and activism. Our rage method is key to exploration of anger and specific implementation of anger and empowering survival strategy for marginalized debaters. Rage can be a source of radical agency. Look at yourself and ask what you can do. Barad 15, the monster always represents a disruption of categories, a disruption of boundaries, and the presence of impurities. So we need monsters, and we need to recognize them and celebrate our own monstrosities. Monstrosity can be a source of political agency. It can empower and radicalize. Examine your own nature, stretch your own body out on the exam of the table, do the work that needs to be done. Reject the resolution, vote for this critique.
Yeah, so that is case. I really I've heard a lot of performances MPF, and I've heard them in like other events. This is one of my favorite. I think it's so the way the performance at the beginning hits you, it's just incredibly emotionally impactful, I feel. I think that's, I mean, that's one of the big things with a lot of performances is how you can get that impact on people. Okay, cool. So yeah, so at the top, we obviously have the performance. I think this is a big part of what this is. So usually, from my experience with like performances are often enactments of the method. So your method is rage, right? And you're being incredibly rageful in the performance. I think that definitely comes across. But I think one really amazing thing you do here is you also set up claims you're going to make later and arguments that you will leverage to like make your ballot key more. And so you'll say stuff and you reference things in your performance. Like judges have implicit biases against Latino debaters. So was that a deliberate strategy you made when you crafted your performance, was to maybe like add on to the kind of links that you're going to go for in the K proper?
I think for me at first, I was just listing out like all of the gripes I had with public forum, right? And one of the biggest ones are like implicit biases that judges have towards Latino debaters. But I think ultimately, like as we started running it and also like learning more about the performance, it did become a way of responding to many arguments about like who's the better debater, or like the judge needs to evaluate this like holistically, and arguments like that. Because it does play out later in round when you're considering like what implicit biases does this judge have, and how will you know that they're not like implicitly biased against certain debaters, even if they might not be like racist on the outside,
Yeah.
right?
Do you think this is like a strategic way to use performances that a lot of Ks have, is to use the performance in kind of like a dual fashion, right? To present the method, but to also present some of the warrants you're going to give later in speech?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's a good method of not just like helping fuel the performance and making it like, I guess, more rageful in this specific example, but it also helps like later in the round, and it's a strategic way to like get the ballot and to like advance the idea you're trying to spread.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh yeah, so I think in the round that we played, what ended up happening was they went for a roll of the ballot about who's the better debater, and we had all of this warrants that was Roberto just read. So all I had to do was just say, hey, Roberto told you all of this stuff that just flat out wasn't addressed in the previous speech. And like we didn't really like, we prepped this entire critique out the night before the tournament. Like we didn't know like all of the potential that this critique could have in terms of like a strategic perspective. So like it was kind of like we were just learning like as every round went, like, oh, like, okay, we can use this warrant, or this warrant helps like, you know, respond to these type of arguments. So it was like kind of cool like, to see like everything kind of unfolding, where it's like
Yeah.
this is like round 5. So it was like really like interesting.
Yeah, I definitely agree that this specific performance fits super well into the round we're gonna watch, and I think that makes the round just like so much of a better round. So the next thing, I don't know, am I scroll down doing this talk? Yeah, let's get down to the stuff down here. These like 6 arguments down here. So this is like part of the performance. And the interesting thing for me, is that in a sense, this is also part of the line by line. Because you know it's not a performance in the same sense as you're talking about the problematic things in public. I mean, you are talking about the problematic things in public forum, but you're also engaging with a lot of the line by line. So do you think that's a strategic thing to do? Because I know a lot of performances will like have the performance and then just like jump straight in, but it feels like this is kind of a more gradual transition. So do you think that's a good idea?
For me, yes, and especially in public forum, because I think a lot of PF judges have kind of a structure that they want to see in many cases. And for me, that was important to like somewhat still have a bit of that structure just so that judges can like ease into like an already like radical case. So having like kind of, you know, a bulleted format or like listing out like the impacts and also like how voting kind of helps to um, mitigate some of these issues. I think that was important for me, and it was also just specifically for PF judges, trying to ease them in. I think it also helps with the overall narrative, right? Instead of just jumping from like a performance to a roll of the ballot, in between there's like a section that's like that transition from the performance to what audit reads at the end.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think one of the reasons, I think that this part is actually one of the biggest reasons why I think this performance is so lay and flay friendly. And I mean, even flow friendly, right? You have to, you know, PF has a huge bias against like non-topical arguments. So you got to try and adapt everything pretty much as you can. So another question I had, so you on your like on your like next 3 warrants, the things about like what the K is supposed to do. So a lot of your offense comes from stuff like discourse, right? It's like we're gonna get to the higher round, people are gonna talk about the K. We're gonna get to a higher round, and like more people are gonna watch us. So what I'm wondering, I guess, is why you have like it's centered in your case, discourse impacts versus like specific things that you could ask for the community.
Audit, would you like to start this one?
Yeah, so like the whole point of the critique was to have people engage with the role of the ballot and provide different survival strategies for marginalized debaters. Obviously, that didn't really happen, but that's like but that was the whole point, to like force them to do that. And like the more people were like talking about the critique through a discourse manner, the more people would be willing to engage like with the role of the ballot. And that's kind of like what happened. Like in round 1, like uh the team just went for straight up topicality, and that was it. But then by the time we hit round 6, they were engaging with the sort of impacts and like the role of the ballot, and it was like, okay, like this is why, you know, the discourse is really important, because like if we keep winning, like they're going to be like, oh no, we might hit this, we need to start prepping this out and reading the literature and understanding like the whole critique. And that's like when the debate started getting like way more intense and way more back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also in addition to what Audit mentioned, it's about creating survival strategies, but also this idea of like, should somebody, I guess, who's oppressed by a system be the same person that have to like give all the solutions or like the specific plan for how we're going to fix this? I think in many instances, like people aren't even aware that this is kind of happening to Black and Latino debaters just because we're so few and far. Like people don't really see us. Like just think like how many Black or Hispanic debaters have you seen like at your tournaments, right? And I barely see them either. So people sometimes aren't even aware that this is a problem. So I think for us, it was also an issue of like, this K is more about like putting it in people's faces that this is a problem and this is an issue, rather than like saying that this is an issue and then also giving all of the solutions, right? We just want to have that discourse, and then during the rounds, like Audit mentioned, we can come up with those survival strategies and really interact with the role of the ballot and how that will play out in PF.
Yeah, that makes a
Uh,
lot of sense.
So something that I was wondering when you talked about engaging with the roll of the ballot, were there any like counter roll of the ballot or other survival strategies you were expecting your opponents to read?
So in this round, I believe it was this round or the previous round, the main role of the ballot was the role of the ballot should be endorsing the team that is the better debater. I think it never really got past that point, but I think it was the second phase. It was like, who is the better debater from a technical standpoint? And then we would follow that up by like, how do you know who's the better debater? Like, it's like, who told you who the better debater was? So it's sort of like that engagement between, oh, this is what the debater should be, and then we're like, no, that we should just like totally destroy that and instead implement our model of the role of the ballot.
Also, I've always found those roll of the ballots exceedingly funny because you can be the better debater and be the one running the K. Like, that roll of the ballot doesn't make it any harder for you. You can just be like, okay, that's the roll of the ballot. I'm winning the round on the flow. Which, because I mean, you can definitely, I think Ks win the round on the flow all the time, and definitely that's what you're trying to go for. And at the end of the day, you're going to make arguments on the flow about why you won most of the time. That doesn't, always happen, but I think generally speaking on PF, that's the kind of ground that Ks go for. So we had like a couple more like more general questions on the K, broadly speaking. So I'm sure everyone noticed this. I think I already mentioned it briefly. But this K is extremely like lay and flay friendly. You read it very slow. The language for the most part is extremely accessible. The arguments make a lot of sense. So do y'all have recommendations to make lit that is kind of abstract, like the Pensis card? I've read that literature. It's very, very abstract stuff. How do you make that literature more acceptable to, or not acceptable, more accessible so that people can, get into the vibe of the literature you're trying to read?
You want to go, Roberto?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think for me, obviously getting into the literature is a bit difficult, but one of the most important things for me, in round especially, like if you're running the K, being able to explain what the literature means kind of in a more simple manner, I think that always helps, especially during crossfire. Like that's a great opportunity to start explaining like what some of this means. But I also think that there are many resources online in terms of like when you start reading literature for like who these authors are, like what's their background, and then like getting into like what specifically they're trying to explain. Because in many instances, like the literature isn't niche, right? Like it's been studied at many universities, like people read it frequently. So there are a lot of resources available for you to like understand what this means. But in the context of the round, I think just explaining it and being able to like, take the most impactful quotes from the literature and just explain it is very helpful. And I think we did this kind of with the, very lay flay performance at the top and the evidence at the bottom. Like it made a lot more sense to the judges, like what the evidence meant and like what we were kind of asking from the judge and opponents.
Also,
Um,
like,
oh yeah,
I have one thing to add. It's like people do like complex literature with substance too. Like there's like so complicated studies and tables and like all this stuff. I don't even know like half the words, but I'll still find a way to like understand like the literature some way, right? And that's because we just take time to like read it. I promise, like it was tough for me at first because I was like, oh, what is this? Like, it doesn't make a lot of sense. But I spent like 5 minutes just like reading it, and then I was like, okay, like, and then bounce it off your partner and like, what do you think this means? Or like, going on the internet, like spend like 5 extra minutes and you're gonna get so much better like understanding, just the same way you do with substance debate.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I also think like I think Roberta mentioned this, like the performance at the top is just so key to get people in the mindset to begin to evaluate this literature, because once you hear the performance and the impact that it has on you, it's way easier to understand the kind of arguments that their cards are making because the cards are speaking to the things that you feel when you hear the performances. So I guess our next question was, going off of like the lay theme, do you have like different versions of this K that you might read on more tech judges? Say you got like an LD judge or something that was okay with you running literally anything.
I think for the camp, we only ran one version of the K. We wanted to make it kind of, okay, so a weird explanation would be like, like there's multi-use tools, right, where you can like use them for like different items and different purposes. And I think that's kind of what we wanted to use this K for, especially since we were just learning how to run it. We didn't want to overcomplicate ourselves with too many cases. I think especially in the case of like PF, there aren't that many Ks run. It's still not very clear like how you're going to run them in PF. Like it's a very gray area. So for us, it was just important to have something that we could use across the board. And even if you had, for example, like an LD judge or a policy judge, I think in many instances they can understand that it's underdeveloped in PF. And especially considering like for many of our opponents, if we were to run like a super technical case, like they wouldn't even be able to interact with what we're running, right? So we still want to make it accessible to our opponents and try to, be as versatile as we can.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that that definitely goes underappreciated about chaos like this is that they are extremely versatile. There's so many different ways you can go for these arguments, and coming out of rebuttal, once they've read the topicality shell, there's so many different ways you can go for offense under that. There's so many different ways you can go for offense under random stuff they say, random rhetoric they use. So I think even if you have an LD judge, reading a lay K is not a bad idea because there's so many other places you can get offense. If it turns out that your opponent spread on you like crazy in rebuttal, then you can just do that in the back half and you'll probably still be fine. But I also agree, like the accessibility is definitely very important, right? Like if the whole point of this is to increase discourse and you're not being accessible, that kind of defeats the purpose of the K a little bit. So yeah, you can ask the next question, Nish.
Yeah, and something I wanted to ask. So I know some people who read performances don't really read cards all the time, or even just reading a lot more tag than you would card. So in terms of reading like evidence when reading a performance K, did you consider like not reading evidence or reading majority tag in attempt to make it more accessible, or your own thoughts, or just generally what are your thoughts on how you should introduce evidence in a performance math?
You should definitely have carded evidence, and like not just because I know that some performance critiques just don't have any evidence, and I'm like, well, then how are we supposed to engage with this role of the ballot, right? Like it's just like reading like substance with no evidence is like weird. It's like, well, how do we know? Like, how can we do any comparison? It's just really, really vague. It's just general warrants, right? So our thing was like, you need to not only just have tags, but just a lot of evidence too. Like it should be a balance. It shouldn't be like you're just reading like, this full page of card with like one sentence of a tag. It should kind of be like a balance. That way, like you're getting a lot of the like author's perspective of the literature, and you're able to sort of like get your own perspective on the literature out there and constructive too. So like it should be definitely a balance, but definitely do have like evidence because that's going to make the debate way more productive.
Yeah, I agree with Audit, and I think especially for like a rage K, like you need to explain why rage is a useful method, and having like credible authors who explain like why rage mobilizes movements or why this method specifically is so good, like that's very helpful, especially because at the camp tournament we didn't encounter this, of course, but there are arguments about how like no, pessimism is a better method, or I don't know, peaceful protest, other different ways of trying to get across these goals, and having the literature there to kind of back up what you're saying, I think it's very important. And I also think one important thing is a lot of PF cards are like, I don't know how to explain it, like Time Magazine, New York Times articles, right? I think that when you're writing a K, it's very important to be able to dive into like more scholarly literature and stuff that might be a bit more abstract, but it will really help drive the point home more. Because I have seen some Ks where the evidence was like, very surface level. And I think that in many cases might hurt you because it doesn't exactly elaborate on like your specific method and strategy.
Yeah. I actually also wrote a Rage K this year with Felix. And one thing we were considering when you were like deciding whether or not we were gonna have cards in it, is that cards are from professional writers, right? Like professional philosophers who are really, really good at writing stuff. If they've been thinking about the concepts that you're thinking about for the past 10 years and they've written 5 books on it, then they're gonna know how to express them really, really well. So I think one thing we've used cards for in the past is just for rhetoric because it's very underappreciated how good the rhetoric can be in certain cards, and how much that can help you out. So I guess another question we had, Is there some places where y'all could have used evidence where you didn't wind up doing it? So places where you talk about like underrepresentation or implicit biases, there have definitely been studies that have been conducted in PF that actually speak to those things. So do you think K debaters need cards on these things, or can we just rely on the analytics?
Yeah, so there are a couple of studies we were considering putting. I think first of all, like obviously the representation stuff. I myself and like Audit, we were looking through the internet very hard to try to find like race statistics on public forum. But actually, what I find very interesting is that those cards don't exist. There are diversity studies in terms of gender, but I think that's where it ends. There's no studies about like race, which I think to me kind of speaks about how like the racial um, like demographics or kind of like what's it called? The racial discrimination in public forum isn't really seen as a big issue, and a lot of people aren't even aware that it's happening, and because there aren't even numbers out there to kind of show you like the lack of Black and Hispanic debaters in the format. And similarly, like there's definitely evidence online. Like recently, there was a Huffington Post article about like the treatment of Black debaters in public forum and in different formats, which could have been incorporated. But I think that specifically for the performance, we decided, first of all, there's not enough evidence about like, you know, representation for us to include. But also, I think that in many cases, when we're just talking about the performance and like the racism in PF, my experiences are kind of enough, right? I do have like the Instagram story that I put up on the slideshow during the performance, right? And I also have like my personal experiences with racism and these statistics that we take from like analyzing different rounds and stuff. So I think all of that was enough for us to kind of drive the point home that racism is kind of a larger issue in the format. And if anyone were to like question like, well, you don't have statistics, I can't believe you that there's racism, I think that's kind of just like silencing somebody who's telling you an experience, right? But I would definitely, I definitely do wish like in the future, like people do studies on like racial demographics in public forum. I think it would be very revealing and probably alarming because I would expect the Black and Hispanic percentages to be like single digit, especially on the national circuit. So I think all of that would be very important. But for now, I don't think it was very necessary for the performance just because we were talking about my personal experiences in PF. But moving into like the method of rage as a way of trying to combat that, that's where we had to use the evidence to prove that rage is an effective method.
Yeah. Okay. So my next question is about the method and like the role of the ballot, kind of. So like this case is like it's tagged as a Latino rage cape. But if you look at the role of the ballot, nowhere does it like say the word Latino. This case is this K is explicitly a generalized rage K, right? It's kind of this idea that we should face oppression in debate and use rage as a survival strategy. Like just generally speaking, like across all minority groups. So is there's like a specific reason you made it like this general instead of being a lot more specific?
Yeah, there was. For me, it came down to intersectionality. Um, it's tagged as a Latino rage cage just because the performance aspect is specific to my experiences as a Latino in public forum. And that obviously, I guess you could trade it out for the things like, for example, an Asian American debater could replace the top performance half with their experiences as an Asian American in debate, or a gender minority debater could do that. But we wanted to make sure, especially going into rounds, that this was an intersectional argument and it was one that considered other experiences in debate too. I mean, if we've been in the PF space, we know that there's a lot of discrimination and implicit biases against like gender minorities and women, and there's also discrimination against like LGBTQ plus debaters. I've also started seeing a lot of Asian American debaters talk about like the model minority myth and how that's influenced their experiences in debate. We wanted to make sure that all of those perspectives were put in, especially because, I used to run Ks before in public forum, and I knew that something that a lot of people who don't have a lot of experience with Ks will say is like, well, you're talking about your Latino experiences, but like, I'm part of this group and we face oppression too. So why should you vote for this K, right, over our experiences? And that did happen at the Delta camp when we ran our K. Like there were people who were like, well, I'm of another group, I'm of another minority, and I face racism, so you shouldn't vote for the K. But I think our point with the K was not to get into an oppression Olympics debate about like which group deserves to get most attention in the round. Rather for us, it was about saying, you know, I've had these experiences in debate. I know that there's other minority debaters who also experience these things. We want to talk about it in an intersectional manner and show how rage as a method in this K can help us all like uplift our voices and stories. So I think it was very important for us to make it intersectional just to be able to avoid getting into oppression Olympics battles and to avoid making people feel excluded by our K, but rather as a comparison of methods, not groups. And I think it was very effective at the camp. We were always able to explain that if anybody were to try and loop us into an oppression Olympics battle, be like, no, that's not our goal. Our goal is to be intersectional and to use rage as a method for justice. And I think that was very important when running the K and when talking about the impacts that it has on people. I don't know if you have anything to add on it. You can.
Yeah, that was just like we had a rough draft, obviously. Like Roberto like sent me a rough draft, and it was like I asked him, like I was like, yeah, this is like oppression Olympics is like a huge thing. Like anytime someone runs any structural violence arguments or something, there's always like a link in, and like someone tries to link in and like, oh well, this group also faces the same thing, and then there's like all this like really weird like, oh my god, like which minority has it worse, and it's just like so ugly, and it's like why are we debating like which minority has it worse? Like that's just like counterintuitive to like the goal of this critique. And so like it was definitely important that we debated strategy, and like we emphasized it in crossfires. Like anytime anyone would ask like, oh well, like I'm a different group, whatever, it's like no, it's about strategy. And like that was like the whole hammered thing that you have to like, whenever you're running a K, make sure it's always about the role of the ballot, not about like, you know, like your experiences are important, but it's not like, oh, we should just reject other people's experiences. It's like, well, this is what happened to me, and this is how we should all who are facing similar experiences combat it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess one last question before we go on to rebuttal. So the K has like the way I look at this K it has like two main parts. So you have your discourse impacts, or like two main impacts. You have your discourse impacts and you have your survival strategy impacts. So do you in your typical round, do you usually, I think this round you go for both, but in a typical round, would you collapse on one of these? Would you go for both of them?
I think in most rounds we ended up going for both, right, Audit? Yeah. It was.
I think so. Like
Because
know
for
that-
us it was kind of, yeah, like we would talk about the discourse impacts, and then sometimes we'd go one step further and talk about how that discourse makes people come up with survival strategies. So it's kind of like a two-step process, and in many rounds that's just what we would explain.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't even realize that, but yeah, that makes sense. Like discourse can link to survival strategies, right? Like if there's a lot of talk about a survival strategy in one round, obviously that thing's gonna spread. So you know, you can run survival strategy stuff as like a personal impact, right? You can say this is like the only reason why I'm still in debate, but you can also run it like more broadly speaking. Yeah, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we have spent like 50 minutes on this case. So we should probably go on to rebuttal because the rest of this round is also pretty fantastic. So let me just share my screen real quick.
Okay, let's start on the topicality stuff. I'm not going to engage with their substance. Our
It froze on my end.
Mine too.
yeah.
survive the activity, it creates a homogenous space which leads to less education because of less diverse perspectives. Also, discourse only becomes diverse if there are different perspectives. They say like, oh, you're going to learn about foreign policy and shit, but it doesn't matter if like I'm gone and all these other Black and Hispanic people are gone. Also on like their specific points, like they tell you that like there's real world change and people become policymakers. Like who becomes policymakers? And the status quo is white people, because I'm not going to learn from debate and become a like the next Latino policymaker based on like quitting this activity. They also say research is needed. I would argue we don't get research as long as we're quitting. On topicality, 1, fiat is illusory. Voting affirming on substance creates no real change. 2, topicality is a fancy way of saying I support the status quo, which is extremely problematic when the score is producing 0 Latinos and TOC elims, causing us to quit and marginalizing us so much. This goes before any benefit they might claim, because as long as the quo causes racism in general, any benefit doesn't matter, and them supporting the status quo is literally a reason to vote them down. 3, substance is literally dangerous for Latinos. Engaging in debate through a topical method is impossible because whatever I say is discounted. Only purpose is to learn and have fair competition, but when that does not exist for Latinos and Black debaters, it's a non-starter. You need to eliminate racism before even talking about fair rules. The fact that I'm quitting proves that substance is dangerous. It's all I've done for the last year, and that hasn't helped me. Only the K has given me retribution and empowerment. 5, topicality is a question of creating fair norms in the activity, but these norms are as fair as saying minorities have equal voting rights while ignoring the fact that POC voters are targeted with voter suppression laws and that there is active propaganda to prevent minorities from voting. Fairness isn't fair as per the status quo on their topicality argument. Also, this debate is not about the resolution. The role of the ballot is clear on topicality as an argument filters via the role of the ballot. If we win the role of ballot, then you have to endorse the better performance that disrupts the debate space. Let's go on to their education nonsense. First of all, fairness is on education. Our education should be prioritized. Their education is a hypothetical resolution that doesn't change anything. Ours is forcing you to realize that all of these arguments are in all of these issues in PF that are causing so much discrimination. Also, our education is first a case debate because the K debate zones out debaters like me who are not seen as equals in the eye of status quo PF. They tell you Ks are inaccessible and this hurts education. One, debate is hard to exist for minority debaters. I don't give a shit if my literature is difficult for you, if your model of debate is difficult for me. One has a lower barrier of entry and it's just reading a card. You're asking me to exist in a space that actively oppresses me. But also the history of K starts with small school debaters. I mean, myself, I go to a school called Brooklyn Tech. No one's heard of that, but I was still able to learn a K through PF videos, other sources like PF Forward. There's no excuse for you to not be able to engage with our K at some level that doesn't have to do with deflecting using a crazy theory shell. Okay, they talk about their role of the ballot, vote for the better debater. I would ask you a couple of questions. First of all, what is a better debater? Because in the status quo, that's usually white men. Like, I could say something so smart and there are judges who will be like, well, you're Hispanic, so obviously it's not going to work out. They also say, like I can say the same thing as a white man and still lose the round. So saying vote for a better debater is just inherently like going back to these white supremacist frameworks that we shouldn't buy. Again, this is about disruption. You should always favor the K about disruption because we tell you that by going through disruption, it's finally forcing debaters to talk about the racism in debate, not just like posting an Instagram story, which they can ignore like they did. I showed you in my first speech. They tell you in all, like they can spread more discourse if we go to runoffs. First of all, no, the feedback loop argument is about higher level rounds, not debating more rounds. Like as long as we still get to octos and are able to like go like the semis and finals, everybody who's still gonna hear it. In fact, going to runoffs is actually against like our sub point A about like Latino success, because what we're trying to prove by running this K is like that Latinos can get buys and that they can also like succeed at the tournament. And remember, there's only 2, so your chances are already very low. Those who say only exclusion makes people change and that there's many reforms that bring people together, I would argue all of these reforms like beyond resolved and like Instagram posts, yeah, like okay, but again, I've already proven that they don't work as much as rage, which actually forces people to put the spotlight on Black and Hispanic debaters. Lastly, on all of their arguments, especially on topicality, just remember that the whole reason they're running this theory shell is to distract from interacting with the racism that we mentioned in our K. This has happened to Dalton YS2. People run so many theory shells to get around this idea. If anything, it's just another distraction. You can't vote on that.
So kind of the first thing that came up to me is just because, like, you know, that's kind of the first thing I think about in every speech is the preferred order. So when y'all are doing a K round, I think in K rounds orders are generally like more complicated than they are in like other rounds. Just because you have like more things to talk about. You have K, roll the ballot. Inevitably, you have T to talk about whatever they dump on your case, and then maybe like other independent offs. So how do y'all usually structure your speeches in K rounds?
See, for me, it's always important to like start with topicality. I think for me, especially because you just have to get through that, like to access the K. So explaining like why it's justified for us to not be topical and for the K to like exist. And then after that, usually we'll talk about the role of the ballot. That's also very important, especially with like many of the role of the ballots that our opponents give us. I mean, they're pretty basic, but any responses on that I think is very good. Other than that, I usually just try to go like line by line. So if our opponents read like the topicality shell and then go into like their voters, sometimes I'll address like maybe their education or like their points about like fairness and explain like why those are not like necessarily accurate. This didn't happen in this round, but sometimes people will read like RVIs. I'll usually respond to those. Like if they say what is it? Usually I think people say like no RVIs. Usually I'll say like yes RVIs for like frivolous theory and stuff like that. So I think overall it's just going line by line, but by the end of the round, I don't usually have a preferred structure. It's just to make sure that I get through everything in a timely manner. And in order to do that, I usually like group a lot of things together and make general arguments to like a lot of sections of the flow, so that we don't necessarily have to go through everything, but our arguments still address everything.
Yeah.
Something that I wanted to ask actually is you bring up a couple like empirical examples, like mentioning Dalton at TOC and a couple other ones. how important do you think this is to the overall persuasiveness of, and I guess like the narrative of your performance in rebuttal and such?
Well, I think like the examples are very helpful for kind of proving a point. So, for example, like, um, I think the Dalton example and like other teams that have run Ks before, it's very important to mention that like this is not just a thing of the Delta camp. Like every time someone runs a K, there is like a whole list of theory cells that people will go through. Whether sometimes people run like distancing theory, topicality, different shells for different things. But I think that calling that out and like giving examples of to why this can be problematic or why this has been destructive in the past to other Ks or other attempts to kind of reform PF is important, and it helps persuade judges. It also shows them that it's not as radical as they think. Like if they know that there's other very successful teams that have run Ks, that's an example, and that helps them think, okay, maybe this is something I can vote on without feeling bad about it, if that makes sense.
I also feel like theory is used a lot of times in PF as kind of a way to get out of having to actually engage with the argument. Because it's not like this argument's impossible to engage with. People have been running rage Ks for a long time. I know for a fact that there are 500-page back files on how to answer rage Ks if you're really desperate and can't possibly think of any arguments yourself. And I think, yeah, I think this a way you can see this trend reflected in other debate events, because PF is not the only event where people achieve stuff. In LD, very frequently in K Aff rounds, it will just be everyone will just run topicality and cap, and that'll just be it every round. And people don't get super creative with their responses. But I feel like when you have really good K teams in the event, they will force you to be creative with your responses. Because if you run topicality against them and only topicality, they will destroy you because they know that argument better than you do, and they will win it every time. So I think a really key thing that sometimes gets left out in discussions about why people winning is so important is because it just does incentivize better engagement. If you know that you really have to know the literature to stand a chance in these rounds, then people are going to learn it. Because if there's anything that PF debaters hate doing, it's losing.
Yeah.
So it's such a powerful motivator, I found. So the next question we had, it kind of goes back to something we touched on a little bit ago. Is how do y'all think you should engage your narrative and like overarching responses versus like straight engagement in the line by line? So like just to give an example, here you talk in this rebuttal, you talk a lot about the argument, about the exclusion argument, right? Like PF and PF judges are extremely biased against Latino debaters, and you cross apply that response in maybe 5 places. I can't remember exactly how many. It's a lot. So what do you think are the benefits of doing that kind of like narrative, like cross application debate versus super specifically engaging with like, no, their education warrant is false, 3 reasons.
I think for me, first of all, like it helps create a narrative, but also many of these arguments are true, right? Like people talk a lot about like the benefits of substance debate, but the problem is that in the status quo, like there are not a lot of Black and Hispanic people who will engage in the substance debate or will like go through all 4 years of PF having like gotten all of that experience. Because many of us quit or like we don't even participate in the first place. And I think that kind of calling those things out instead of just like going through each point and trying to give like 3 generic like counter examples, instead like cross applying the case kind of helps, in many cases prove to the judges why like the current method of thinking that we have in public forum is so flawed. So for example, like people will just read a bunch of generic impacts about why substance is so great or why fairness is so important. But like they read those examples without taking into account what does fairness mean to like a Latino debater or what looks fair to like a minority debater. And those are things that you can call out by cross applying a case and having very similar things. I think another example in that case is like, well, yeah, that's the exclusion one. But also like you mentioned earlier about judges having implicit biases and how that can impact things like roll of the ballots that talk about who's the better debater. I think that's also a great cross application of the K, right? Because in that example, we're talking about, okay, sure, like if we go back to the standard PF method of like evaluating the better debater, but what does that mean, right? In the status quo, that's like taller people, white people, men, right? People with deeper voices. And those are things that have to be taken into consideration. So for me, it's all about creating a narrative and letting the judge know that all of the examples our opponents providing at the end of the day are going back to this main theme of what PF looks like now and why that's such a problem. And going back to this idea that we need to change it. So for me, that's just the general idea.
Another thing here, I'll just let me say something really quickly.
Yeah.
Is that a lot of performance debaters are running their case like for activism, and I think that's true for like almost all performance debaters. That this is a thing that they want to do because they want to promote like the cause that the K is advocating for. They like truly believe it. It's something super deep and personal to them. And if that's true, then using these kind of overarching responses that applies everywhere and getting that narrative good is going to help the cause that you're debating, right? Because if people have these arguments that are like, do we really care if people know the 3 reasons why your education standard is like false? Because these are like arguments that I thought of, or does it really matter that people know that debate is incredibly skewed against minority debaters? I think it's pretty obvious that the thing that this K is trying to say is the second one and not the first one. So I think it's a really important thing for getting to that end goal is using these kinds of responses.
Yeah, and also like instead of trying to like engage with everywhere on the flow, when in reality a lot of the stuff that comes out of second rebuttal is the same idea or same narrative. Like topicality good, their roll of the ballot is bad because topicality is good. Like it's like the soul circular reasoning that it's just so easy to be like, well, we're gonna punish you for not interacting with the line by line on our critique, and centering like centering the debate around our critique is like a way of saying you don't interact with our critique, so why are we gonna like engage with your offense that means nothing?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Audit. You know, you definitely don't want to like be forced to like spread so quickly that people don't understand what you're saying when it comes to your K, right, or the story you're trying to present. But if you were to go like line by line and give those 3 individual responses to everything, like you would inevitably have to spread really quickly. And I think for me, like it's going back to like what are things you can group together to try to like reduce what you have to say. Like overall, you don't want to get into a debate where it's like you drop sub point 3 of point A of this overall point and then like lose the round. Rather, it's more about getting those general ideas and grouping things together. And I think for us that strategy worked a lot, especially when people like dump responses because they're afraid of like really interacting with the K.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So the next big thing we of course have to talk about is the only argument that people seem to read against these kind of apps, which is of course topicality. And you know, it's always going to be something that KF debaters have to understand how to deal with because it's going to be here forever. So we had a few questions on topicality in general and how you'll dealt with it. So if you know everyone is flowing rebuttal, you'll notice that at the top, when Roberto gets topicality, they read like a bunch of disads. I think there were like, I mean, depending on what you count as a disad and what you don't, there were either like 4 or 5. So what do y'all think about top shelf disads on T? Stuff like the status quo is racist, so supporting topicality is a racist thing and means that you should reject them, or substance is bad because nobody listens to Latino debaters. Stuff that's like a cross application, but again like re-implication of other arguments. So how do you think those things work with top shelf level responses on T?
You can go on it.
I think it works pretty well. Like for the same reason why like focusing on your arguments are more important, but also I think like they're gonna make like a lot of like niche theory arguments or like stuff that like obviously maybe we just didn't understand, right? Like we didn't understand like all of the voters or all of the standards of the theory shell, but we did know that the entire theory shell is just like bad. So we made overarching responses to the concept of the theory shell rather than engaging the line by line. Because especially like we're not the most progressively like oriented debaters. So like if we were presented like this mad like topicality show with like all these like niche warrants and stuff, like interacting with the line by line is kind of tough. So like presenting like these massive like disads at the top and being like this is also and implicating it to like some of the voters was much easier. And like especially like rethinking what topicality was. I think like people think that topicality is aff or neg, and I think one thing that we kind of learned is like why is topicality aff or neg on substance? Why can't topicality be what we're doing? Why can't we be topical? Why isn't our critique topical? So we kind of, I think what Roberto was reading, the weighing argument, right? and this is when I extend in summaries, like our thing is prefer our method of what topical debate looks like, because it protects minorities, and therefore short circuits all of their stuff.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. So I guess the next question I have for y'all, so in my experience running identity apps, I don't know if this happened to y'all, but something that would happen very frequently is people would use rhetoric that would be extremely bad, like extremely problematic rhetoric. They'd say something like, "Oh, like anti-Semitism isn't a problem anymore." I'd just be like, "Excuse me, what? Like, what did you just say?" So I don't know if y'all encountered any of that rhetoric, but if you did, how did you deal with it? So one way that a lot of KF debaters will do is they'll read independent voters on it, or they'll try and engage with it at a broad level and say like, "This is really bad. You have to do something to change the way this round works to like substantially punish them for reading rhetoric like this." So did y'all read Disads on any like bad rhetoric you faced?
I mean, for me, like, first of all, like, I'd always expect that to happen. I think that in many instances, like, people are not intentionally, like, I guess, saying things that are like racist against Latinos or other groups, but rather just, the way PF is, everybody wants to come up with an argument against something. So inevitably people will say problematic things that maybe didn't mean, and after the round, sometimes we'd get like apologies and stuff for it. Um, my ways of dealing with it, like, they depended. Sometimes we would think of like independent voters to run. I think in some rounds, for example, like there was one round, for example, where we like, what was it? We faced like a Holocaust comparison. Like somebody said that I don't know. It was kind of okay. So they said that by running a K, we were like blaming white people for all of the problems Latinos faced, and then that'll end up in a genocide against white people or something, kind of like the Holocaust. I think that like for us, we were going like we had an independent voter ready for like why this is problematic, and kind of like it ties to other things like the way people frame like Black Lives Matter as a terrorist group, for example. Like there's other ways that this type of framing of like social justice movements can kind of prevent progress. But I think that overall, like sometimes we decided that it'd just be better to focus on the substance, and after the round, like talk to the people and explain to them why it's problematic. Or what I would do often was go into Crossfire and like explain to the judge and the opponents why something they said was problematic. I think another example of something we did was in like a different round, we had an opponent mention, and this is a part where I actually really got angry, where an opponent mentioned that we were making like the white people at the camp uncomfortable by running this K. And I think for us, like we just use that to kind of say, well, she's proving our point. The rhetoric they're using proves the point as to why the K has to be used. And that's the same thing we did with like the Holocaust comparison and round. We kind of incorporated it rather than making it a separate independent voter. We were like, this is proof that something needs to be done about what we're seeing in the round. So overall, that's kind of what we did. I don't know if you have anything to add on it.
It was just like we never made them independent per se. We just sort of said they're linking into the critique, sort of. It's just another reason to vote for our thing. It's just like they're just relinking, and there was like a bunch of stuff. Like they would read like 5 different responses, and they would all be links into the critique, and we'll be like, this is also a reason they link into the critique. So that's kind of what we did, rather than reading individual.
So I have like two thoughts on this quickly. So one thing I've heard is people use rhetoric like this to make presumption arguments, which I think is really interesting. So they'll say something that's problematic, and you'll be like, okay, that's kind of problematic. Just presume neg, or presume whatever side you are. If you can't make a decision, just vote against somebody who used problematic rhetoric, and that way you don't have to spend a whole ton of time explaining the argument. You don't have to spend a long time like going out and doing an independent voter. And we've like discussed this in previous episodes. Presumption is very strategic to have in the bag, especially in K Aff rounds, where often the decision is very close, especially because judges seem to have a very hard time evaluating these arguments because they're not very exposed to them. So just giving a judge another reason to vote for you is always good. The second thing is that I will never cease to be amazed by the amount of problematic stuff people can say in this event. I'm so sorry that happened to you, y'all. That's crazy. I can't. Yeah, people say crazy stuff when they're jacked up on the adrenaline of debate. And definitely figuring out how to deal with it, especially when it's like arguments that are super personal. It's definitely definitely a thing to think about when you're going to run these Ks.
Yeah, I'll also add, I think there's something for people to think about when you run into a K, like minding the language that you use. I know other example of things, like there were people who said like debate is not racist, or like, there is no way that, like somebody else was like, you're just running the K because, you know, you're mad that like you can't win rounds or whatever, and you're blaming it on racism and stuff like that. I think that kind of thinking through like the arguments you're making and what you're trying to portray is very important when you're running against decay. And that's why I think it's so important for people to get more used to like interacting with the role of the ballot and the actual, I guess what the K is actually about, right? Because once you start talking about what the role of the ballot and we advance beyond like topicality and all of this stuff, there's less room for you to say problematic things or things that you didn't mean to say, but that come out in like the adrenaline rush, like you mentioned.
100% agree. Engage with the role is like primary go-to, and it's like you can't really say anything problematic about like rage bad. Like I don't know like how you could, I don't know, like people may find a way. People
will find a way to say something problematic about that.
But I think it's like engaging with the strategies is probably a more constructive way than just like criticizing like the critique links and like the overall like concept of why a critique is read. Like it's just, and it's also like more productive debate. Like you're gonna learn something if you engage in the role of the ballot. So I think it's probably a priority.
I think as PF comes into more progressiveness, like or becomes more progressive, people will stop being like, okay, that's horrible, it's whatever, and say problematic stuff. I think people will start to be able to like respond in a less problematic way. Like reading a TVA, for example, which is something I was going to mention, or a topical version of the AF. Is that something you ever ran into? Someone basically was like, you can do the same thing that you're doing, but topically, and how did you end up dealing with that?
Oh yeah, we did run into this. I think our response was just like asking them to prove it. Like, in Crossfire, we'd be like, okay, so how would you structure a topical version of the AF? For us, in many cases, it was just about explaining how, trying to tie, I guess, Latino oppression in the debate space to like NATO would make it very difficult to, well, first of all, like the topic is literally about Eastern Europe. Like you can't get more, like there are very few regions of the world with fewer people of color. So I think that trying to like, so for us, like it was pretty easy to talk about how like it's really hard to come up with a way to kind of link that into our personal experiences, and trying to force you to make a K topical prevents us from really getting into a lot of the racism and stuff that people experience because it wouldn't be considered topical. So for us, that was like a pretty simple way of talking about that. And trying to ask people to kind of prove like, how would you rate a topical version of the AF?
Yeah, and if you have like unique benefits to being non-topical, like he talked about, that obviously will help you too.
Right, and that's something you just mentioned. Like, it is your performance, and the role of about you're going for is about like your race specifically and like your experiences. And like, even if you were to like have a soft left or structural violence argument, it wouldn't be the same thing as you raging or you having your own experiences and reading rage. So it really wouldn't like have the same impacts or the same really link into the role of the ballot, even if it was a topical version.
Yeah, people's TVAs tend to be exceedingly silly. Make better TVAs, people. It's not extremely all that hard. But please make them not so silly. So yeah.
You want to play summary?
Yeah, let's move on to summary.
Now, the biggest issue with all of their responses is they try to make RK about identity. RK is not about identity. It's about the way we improve the lives of marginalized debaters, which means we affect every single marginalized debater. The way we do this is through rage. We say that disrupting the debate space is the best way to advocate for minorities. It doesn't matter if it's Hispanic or women. Our link is just talking about Roberto's personal experiences. We still impact all other marginalized debaters, but let's extend the critique anyway. We tell you PF debate is horrible for Latinos and other minorities. A, they're severely underrepresented. B, they're stereotyped by judges, and the impact is twofold. One, Latinos and others feel excluded and face marginalization, and Black and Latino debaters literally quit like Roberto's doing. We tell you the role of the debater is ballot is to endorse the team that most disrupts the debate spaces and means to liberate, includes marginalized debaters. Extend the Misogyny 5 evidence that finds that rage mobilizes movements, and the Pensis 2 evidence that finds that rage is needed to protect people that can resist and advocate. We solve through disruption by voting us up disrupts by creating Latino excellence and success. This forces implicit biases to change and people to change as they see a good debater from if a Hispanic makes it to elims, but also it creates a feedback loop. In this round alone, people are hearing Roberto's story. You vote us up, goes past elims, where in higher level debates where people engage more with the role of the ballot and more strategies. Their response is saying that they're trying to respond to our argument that this is the model of debate for topicality. It's just that if there's no survivor techniques, there's no minorities. What is even that response? Our argument is simple. The reason why you endorse our form of topicality is because discussing these issues employs survival techniques that keeps marginalized debaters in the debate space and also allows for a less homogenous debate space, which allows for education and fairness because there's more diverse perspectives. This literally means in order for them to engage all of their offense, they need to first employ survival techniques, which is literally the round is over at this point. But then let's just go to their offense on fairness. One, they've conceded that these reading topicality arguments to preserve fairness only diversity and hides the issue.
Oh no, I think it's cutting off.
More importantly, on education. They've conceded that their education doesn't matter insofar as A, there's implicit biases that prevent harmful education, but B, debaters are also quitting, so no one can access the education or all the impacts that they talk about. Then go to on the individual terms on a roll of the ballot. They just say it links into an identity and creates some sort of identity division. That's not our argument. Our argument helps all marginalized debaters create a voice through rage, which is our argument. They have conceded that. Then let's go to, their role of the ballot just says that we should have the better debater. That's so nebulous. Like even in a flow just, there's implicit biases that need to be called out, which means their argument just isn't disruptive enough. Also, okay, they say that we have to lose in runoffs. Like that doesn't make any sense. If we go to higher level rounds sooner, A, you're gonna have much better discussion about strategies, and B, like there's gonna be more high level debate and less silly topicality shells.
Okay, so let's get into some questions I had on summary. So on the, I guess we already talked about this like a little bit. So you kind of extend this disad about topicality being a thing that's racist. But there's like, you don't spend a lot of time on it, or you kind of just like go over the disad and then end it there. But one thing I noticed is that you use that implication of topicality being racist on other parts of the flow. So do you think that's a strategic thing to do with disads, where you engage with them at like a link level and then take that link and apply it other places?
For sure. Like, I know that like for the top level, the first thing that I said in the first response to their offense was like, employ our model of topicality because if you don't, there's gonna be a homogenous space and that's bad for education and fairness. And then I went on fairness and been like, this is what their space looks like. And I kind of implicated the responses on like their fairness and education voters from that top level response that I made. It's super helpful and it like makes a whole narrative. Like one of the reasons like Kay just voted for us was like, yeah, like the whole reason like we should the topicality shell doesn't really work is because like of the prereq analysis that we read at the top and then implicate it to all of the voters. So it makes it kind of tough to vote for a topicality shell like that.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense.
Like using stuff that you mentioned earlier and then using it to like I think something that people don't really talk about, especially when you're reading K arguments. Like even if like let's say it's hyper fast team reads like 100 topicality whatever standards or something. In summary, they're not going to extend all of them, and the ones they do extend, you can use your K and you can use the arguments you made thus far to weigh against it, especially the prereq analysis, which is one of the more preferable forms of weighing. It's always something that you want to do, and will set you up pretty good in the back half, even if you can't cover like a ton of topicality standards.
Yeah, and prereqs on identity apps are really crazy. There's a lot of weighing you can do. I think y'all showed off a decent amount of this in this round. There's definitely a lot more out there. So I would encourage everyone to go watch a bunch of rounds where you have performance apps and learn about how you can leverage that weighing against topicality in different measures, especially if you're considering running one of these yourself, because I think weighing against topicality and like, again, as we already talked about, like engaging less with their specific standards, more with broader narrative is definitely a key thing to do. So the next question we had, so there's this new disad that they read in their last speech. We're not gonna like play their speeches, but this is a new disad from what I understand of it, which is not very much because I didn't get the doc and it was really fast. It's a disad on identity politics. So in I think your K deals pretty well with this. And so in it being, it's a universal K, but because it's about like rage in general. But did you ever deal with people indicting your performance using one of these kind of disads?
I mean, yeah, like in various rounds, we encounter people saying like, you know, identity politics are bad, or like you shouldn't, I guess, talk about your experiences being Latino because it excludes other groups. But I think like even just restating that argument, it it's very silly, right? I think it's a very for us, like it was never a problem because it's pretty easy to respond to it. As you mentioned, like our K is intersectional, and also our goal is not to only emphasize like one group. It's to have a general method for helping marginalized debaters. So it was never that difficult to interact with things like identity, identity politic Ks and other types of like disads and responses that people might have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I remember whenever I heard disads about identity apps, I would think of them as like Steven Crowder disads. Like you should be able to win these, realistically speaking. That I think, you can definitely run disads of identity politics in ways that, aren't terribly problematic. But I think generally speaking, people don't go that route, unfortunately. But yeah, please engage with the arguments better.
I think
Yeah.
you can make an identity politics argument, but like you have to know what you're talking about. Like you have to read the cards. So
Yeah.
make sure you, when you're responding to a critique, like actually read the cards you're reading. Don't just copy paste from a back file and paste it in and be like, oh
Yeah.
I got it.
I remember something else. Is that so? The evidence you read, I actually recognize some of it. The Pensis evidence, and some of the other evidence you read is very intersectional. So I think that's one thing that really boosts your K is that you're not only citing like authors writing about like Latino oppression. The Pensis is writing about queer oppression. So you can really utilize the intersectionality of your cards as a way to frontline against identity politics specific arguments. I think that's really smart. Especially because the Pensis card is just like it's just a really good card, generally speaking. I think that was all the questions we had for summary generally, just 'cause, like a lot of the stuff is like kind of the same arguments. So let's go on to final focus.
This round is pretty clean. First of all, PF debate is horrible for Latinos and other minorities. One, we are severely underrepresented. Two, we are seen as dumber, and implicit biases mean we win more rounds for the same thing. Two, the impact is twofold. One, Latinos feel excluded and face marginalization. And second, Black and Latino debaters literally quit like I am doing because I am tired of this racism. The role of the ballot is to endorse a team that most disrupts the debate space as a means to liberate and include marginalized debaters. Is Send Shoutout 85, which finds that rage mobilizes movements, and Pensis 2, which finds rage is needed to protect people so that they can resist and advocate. They literally concede all this evidence throughout the entire debate round. That's why we do our role of the ballot should always come first, because a better debater, that is so nebulous. The whole reason this case was run, because so many judges have implicit biases that make them vote down Black and Latino debaters. We are not seen as a better debater in the status quo. That's why you need to vote for disruption, which is very clear in telling you, forcing in POC views and stories. Also, disruption is not judge intervention like they mentioned. It's literally a debater telling you how to evaluate the round based on scholarly literature, which makes it very easy and simple. No intervention needed. We solved the disruption. First, voting us up disrupts by creating Latino excellence and success. This forces implicit biases to change people to change what they see as a good debater. This will be crucial later. Second, it creates a feedback loop. In this round alone, people are hearing my story. And again, going to octos, quarters, etc. means more people hear it. On their topicality stuff, again, they completely mishandle all of the responses we make. Again, we tell you our interpretation of topicality as a model of debate is to create strategies to help marginalized debaters in the debate space as a result of white splice, specifically a lack of survival strategies pre-writes topicality, because if there aren't survival tactics, that creates a homogenous space which leads to less education because of less diverse perspectives. Specifically in the status quo, Black and Latino people keep quitting the activity again and time again, which means that we're never going to benefit from any of this education they talk about in their topicality stuff and anything. And just there, even if you buy the disruption role of the ballot, like it's a very clean win for them. So then going on to their telling, they see there's rage outside of debate. They can see the fact that I've literally ranted about debate so many times outside of the round and everyone has ignored it. This is the only way I've done it. They say Ks are inaccessible to who, again, we tell you Black and Latino debaters feel like feel empowered when we run this, and we literally run this off of internet videos. Like there's nothing crazy about that. Lastly, they just tell you the schools fun debate about topical stuff. Again, this is just some crazy, like, this is a crazy fear mongering, again, distracting from all of the real racism talk we're having. And at the end of the day, policy and other formats disprove this stuff. Like, you shouldn't be buying this, especially if you buy a roll of the ballot.
So one thing I've been wanting to ask, but I kind of wanted to save it to final focus, is it's talking about extensions. So I think extensions are a really important thing with critiques. I was wondering, did y'all have pre-written extensions for this K?
Yeah, we had some pre-written extensions.
Yeah.
We didn't have them in round one. I know that for sure. And it was like really, really messy, especially in like my summary speech. I was like kind of going all over the place. And then after that, we started really like we had pre-written extensions. The back half was like really, really smooth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
one
they
other
were
thing,
pretty simple.
Yeah.
Sorry, they were very simple, just like bullet points about what the K was about.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the goal of the extension is just to like explain the K in a very similar or very easy to understand way. So one thing I was wondering is so did you extend things differently in different speeches? And if so, what was the thinking behind like how you should change up your extensions versus for like rebuttal, summary, or final?
Well, I think for rebuttal, there's obviously more time, so that gives us more time to like be a little more thorough and also to cross apply to more things. I think by the final focus, things have narrowed down. It's a bit more clear, like the direction the round is going in. So in that case, like we'll usually just limit what we extend. And for us, usually by final focus, it's not about like extending every little point we made, but rather like sticking to one idea. Like for example, public forum, judges are implicitly biased against Latinos. Some idea like that, and then cross applying against any responses that they extended by the end of the round. And for us, that was our method for like the final focus and our extensions throughout the round.
Yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. I think it's a good idea to think about. Even, this is broader advice than just like when you're running a K Aff, but like think of making your extensions more simple with every speech. I feel like people just read the same extension every single time. But you should definitely be thinking about it differently. We had like one more question on this. So do you extend things differently if you have different judges, right? If you have, the ultimate tech LDer, do you wind up extending the K in a different way than if you have like some parent judging this K?
I would say like if you have a parent,
Oh
obviously
yeah, I mean,
heavy
I'm going a bit farther, but
yeah. But if you have like a really non-progressive flow judge, probably go full like PF mode extensions like we did in summary. But like if it's an LD or policy judge, ideally you just have to extend like a 1 or 2 sentence, because like I know the norm in LD and policy is like you don't really have to extend like the line by line, like that's not necessary on like K Affs. So like you just need to extend like some like overview of the critique and you're good. So, but honestly, like now that I'm thinking about it and I'm reflecting on the rounds, I think extending all of the parts kind of works to an advantage where you're like, oh, well, like you can just cross by here, like cross by this part, cross by. All you're saying is just they've missed this part of the critique. You can cross by it here. I think that's a little bit more word efficient, but it's up to you, kind of like how you want to phrase it when it's a really tech LD judge.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think one thing about this K that's really nice is there's so many spikes in it. If you go and like look at that K stock, there's a lot of places where you spiked out like half of the T arguments that exist. And so I think when you're in, a lot of these are ingrained in the way that the K is formatted and the way that the arguments of the K actually work. So like arguments about exclusion, prereq, a lot of topicality impacts about like fairness. So, in a way, like learning how to use those extensions as a method of combating, common things that you're going to see is very strategic because it can, reinforce your narrative a lot better. So I believe that's all the questions we had. And thank you so much for coming on today, Roberto and Aadit. If there are any other debaters or teams that y'all want to hear from, let us know in the comments. And of course, if any other top debaters want to be on the podcast, hit me or Niche up. Might be able to get you on the channel. Make sure to drop a sub, hit the like button if you like the video. It's free, it helps us on the algorithm, so more debaters are going to see the video. Thank you so much for watching. Adios, y'all.